Hi all. I just thought I'd throw out a quick note after watching the Chancellor's speech this morning, which was probably 25 minutes of my life that I can happily wish that I could get back, but I can't. I have to say, to kind of set the scene on it, you've had now for the last 2.5 months at least a series of kite flying exercises by the Exchequer of different ideas on how they can raise taxes on the general public. This has been ongoing. This is exactly what they did last year, and it is so damaging to business and public confidence because everyone just sits there waiting for the cliff to fall on them. That's the position we're in. That's basically what they've been doing. In terms of the actual speech, she started out laying out what she said were Labour's, I believe, said objectives or priorities, which was obviously the NHS first. I mean, it is Labour's religion. You know, everyone can't not have the Labour there, have the NHS there. It's usually the thing thrown on the table when they know they've got bad news and they want to try and rustle up some moral leadership or moral righteousness so that people don't argue too much with them. Obviously, that reducing our debt, stop laughing at the back there. Cost of living, definitely stop laughing at the back there. And then obviously she did what she had to do from last year, which is keep banging on about the mythical £22 billion black hole that everyone knows didn't exist. That set the tone for the whole thing. She then kind of went on to progress to lie about guilt, stating that the yield rises were down to the Tories and everything else. This is factually incorrect. You can actually look at it. Gilt yields actually bottomed out. I think it was at the end of August, beginning of September last year, just about the time that she and the whole Labour government began briefing just how bad the economy was on the build up to her first budget, which then sent them skyrocketing upwards. And they carried on going from there all the way into December. Now, I don't necessarily say that 100% all of that is down to Labour. There are other issues out there that are affecting debt markets. But for her to basically say that she'd received a poisonous inheritance from the Tories in terms of the gilt yields is a complete and utter lie and should shame anyone saying it. She then rolled on to talk about welfare reform and how it was a moral imperative and everything else, which, again, it's somewhat of it's slightly offensive to anyone who's genuinely is concerned about the welfare bill, particularly the sheer level of fraud within the personal independence payments part of it for the Labour, which has once again decided to kick welfare reform into the long grass because they can't get it through Parliament because of their own leadership, their own party colleagues in the parliamentary party. It's offensive. And you can speak all you like about the moral imperative for it and everything else, but if you're not actually willing to have that argument and that fight with your own party, and your own party can't actually cope with the idea that actually sometimes the moral thing is to force people to go and get jobs and not to make people like you and I, who pay the bills for the whole country as taxpayers, pay for people who are basically should be doing something with their lives. You shouldn't really be pushing out there as some sort of moral crusade that you particularly care about. Her point, she made a point about the OBR, downgrading productivity. This has been something the OBR should have done going back probably five years ago. The productivity figures have been nonsense for that long at least. Every year they always give a nice little graph where they indicate productivity is going to suddenly take back off again, and it never does. However, for Labour to complain about that whilst also doubling down on every one of the policies and choices which have almost certainly led to the collapse in productivity from mass migration through to higher and higher energy bills and additional regulation, etc., is again, it's actually offensive to anyone who's vaguely got kind of some semblance of a grasp of what's going on, or simply using basic logic. Her point beyond obviously productivity and how bad the evil Tories have been, etc., is obviously to blame Brexit and austerity. Now, as someone who was a critique of austerity at the time and still remains so in terms of how it was done, and I'm the first to hold his hand up and go, of course, Brexit, changing your trade arrangements will have short-term impacts on the economy. I find this, again, I just found it offensive because, again, it's just excuse making. Brexit would have caused a short-term hit to the economy, barely even measurable, and austerity, yes, it impacted staff. Yes, you could see that actually in the growth figures and everything else. However, that was 15 years ago. And you knew before you got into government that the outcomes from both of those events. So to blame both for where you are now is offensive, but it's actually, it shows a level of intellectual bankruptcy that I think that, is now the norm across whole chunks of Parliament, to be honest. I mean, in summary, the NHS is a productivity hellhole, as is pretty much the entire public sector. I mean, you can go look at the graphs from the ONS, OBR and everything else. It really doesn't need more money in the classic sense. It needs radical reform. And in terms of people employed, probably a chainsaw. That sounds awful. I'm not for one saying that there isn't a lot of, people who would be personally impacted and everything else by choices to radically reshape the public sector, but that's the reality of it. We just cannot go on like that this way. The state now consumes 45% of around about 45% of all GDP, and productivity hasn't grown for a decade or so. I mean, no wonder productivity is stagnant. You're effectively increasing the size of the part of the economy that's not has no productivity gains. I mean, put that beside everything else. It's like no wonder productivity is not rising. So really, you've got two choices or three choices there. You've got a couple of choices there. All of them should be taken, which is you should be pruning back the size of the state, forcing the state to be actually more efficient. I mean, that's the reality of it. You would then, and then on top of that, obviously, in terms of the rest of the economy, reform to reduce regulation, reduce massively the cost of energy, and then basically curtail cheap mass migration from basically chunks of the third world, of which these people come in and doing very badly paid jobs, which basically stop companies from actually investing in automation because they have no reason to. It's cheaper for them to just employ a person to lift box from here to here rather than building a robot to do it. That's the reality of it. In terms of her, I'm going to reduce the debt, she's not going to get anywhere near a balanced budget. Nowhere near. I mean, just stop. Just stop. Okay? Furthermore, I suspect this budget, but when it finally comes out, will have been shown that the build-up to the budget alone will have tanked the economy. Certainly everyone I know is very wary of spending money and have been for several years. I think this will just make it worse. Furthermore, when the budget comes out and people like you and I suddenly realise that we're paying an extra 150 quid a month on tax or something like that, that will tank demand. So by trying to raise taxes to balance to get nearer to a balanced budget, she'll actually find that growth is lower, which basically means that she'll end up probably in the same place she is now. And that comes down to the fact that I think that the British economy pretty much probably last year passed the moment when additional tax rises will actually raise incrementally much more tax, just because of the fact of the knock-on secondary effects on the rest of the economy. Consumption makes up, 65, something like that, percent of the economy. So the more you tax you and I, the less we will consume, the less we will spend in the economy. So you're simply taking from Peter to pay Paul in this case. Finally, I mean, and this feeds on from that last point. Finally, her government solution to the cost of living is apparently just to take even more money from you and I, so we have even less money to pay for the stuff that we need to. I mean, it's a genius outcome. It won't solve the and by the way, that in itself, if you're in an inflationary spiral, is not necessarily a bad thing, tamping down on demand. Okay, but this is not, from what I can see, particularly a demand-led inflationary spike. This is being driven by tax rises and energy costs, and so effectively it's a government-driven inflationary spike. We've got, if you look around the world, we've got an oil glut. Gas prices are low. There's no energy price problem here. We have a government policy problem which has pushed our energy prices up and up and up, and Wingnut Miliband is doing it even more again. So crushing us with more tax rises is not going to solve your inflationary spike. What it's going to do is just basically take away from the public their ability to adapt to the higher prices that the government is driving through us or through the system time and time again. We move forward. I mean, one of the things that I was very noticeable through the speeches, because she likes to come back to it, is like, I fix the foundations of the economy, and as someone rightly wrote on Twitter, which is, well, if you fix the foundations, how comes you're taxing us even more? You fixed your foundations last year with the largest, or if not the largest, if not one of the largest tax raising budgets in national history. National history, and you're coming back 12 months later to fix the foundations again with even more tax rises. You've kind of demonstrated that you didn't fix anything. You just broke everything even more. I mean, from that perspective, as I said, I think second time round, raising taxes will be twice as damaging, both at terms of to the economy, but actually also to public mood and business confidence. I think both will basically spiral. And I think there will be a knock-on impact, obviously, in terms of the politics of it. She finished up with a wonderful moment of taking questions to talk about a speech that was not about the budget per se, but couldn't really actually talk about anything because apparently it was about the budget and she wasn't going to go into details, which kind of gave us the finishing point to the whole thing. I mean, overall, I just found it vacuous, blustering, intellectually quite bankrupt. There was no admission of fault. There was no even pivot to change direction. There was nothing to indicate the fact that she'd learned any lessons from last year. It was just basically plough ahead, more of the same, because, more of the same. That's basically all we got from it. The government clearly has no idea what it's doing, nor has it got any willingness to actually change direction or listen to anyone else. The actual speech overall, I thought the best word for it was probably bloviating. You can look that up if you don't know what it means. I have to say, kind of from a political perspective, I was just left wondering who signed off on the speech. It just seemed so weird. You've already done 2 months of kite flying. You've already done so much damage. Why have this speech 3 weeks before the budget? It doesn't add very much to anything. If anything, it takes away from a great deal. As Sean, a friend of mine on Twitter, said, he thought it was probably to do with party management. I mean, maybe, but I mean, if she's, maybe it is, if a Chancellor of the Exchequer 3 weeks before a budget, which everyone knows is going to be bad because of her incompetence, is having to debate effectively with her own party on national TV rather than behind doors in Parliament, then that speaks volumes of basically where she is and how long she's got to live in that role. She came out of this speech, in my opinion, looking weaker, much more forlorn politically, and I would argue that the lack of willingness to even admit kind of any mistakes in the past probably in a lot of ways will just enrage millions of people. People, look, I'm already angry, so it doesn't take anything from, it won't make any difference to me, but I think other people will be very, very angry, particularly when they read or listen to little snippets of the speech. The politics are, I would argue, complicated but quite straightforward. And let me go with that. The Labour promised not to raise taxes before getting elected, and it is now going to do a second budget, which appears to be, it will be another massive tax raising budget. That it will be absolutely toxic. Where it will be even more toxic, I suspect, is how that intersects with the perception of how the government is spending people's money. And what I mean by that is millions of people now look at government and go, you're squandering my money in record amounts, and half of it, and that it's not half of it, but that's how people perceive it, is it's going on people who I don't even want in this country. And I think that intersection intersection of those two issues will be absolutely toxic. Absolutely toxic. I think she is done, and I suspect this government is done. And when I mean this government is, I don't think Starmer has too long for this world as Prime Minister. I've said that before. And I don't think that when anyone new is finally appointed, I don't think it will make any difference. This is structural. I think that Labour is basically dying on its arse now. And I think this budget is just another signpost along the way. As I've said on Twitter, and I'll say it here, I think Labour's going to somewhere between 10 and 12% in the polls. They will be behind the Tories. They will be behind the Greens, and probably even the Lib Dems. There is no solution for them because fundamentally their electoral coalition is not going to allow them to do anything that needs to be done. Furthermore, the Parliamentary Labour Party is basically just a load of out of touch cranks for the most part, and these are not people who are capable of looking at the world, adapting to it, and then going out to teach, to politically teach, if you like, their own membership and voters and the broader country about why hard choices have to be made. So instead, everything is just locked into kind of a status quo. It's just we go forward until something snaps. Anyway, I've watched it, so you don't need to, but if you've got any opinions, throw them in. I'd be keen to hear your views. Thanks.